G'day YouTube, Warble's on a lot here. Coming up to a quarter to 11 on the 10th of September 2018. That for once I'm here at the right time on the right day, and I've remembered in time, in between fitting the new ultraviolet pool cover and consulting the pyramid as to the current state of play with the batteries stored therein, and while monitoring the resuscitation process of this pair of batteries and the 3 panels being connected and disconnected to keep them from overcharging by adding and subtracting panels depending on what's required. So there I was, playing with my pyramid as the hour approached 11. So therefore perhaps I remembered in time to leave the scene of all this busyness and go for a bit of a walk. And still be in time. After wandering along up to the end of the wet weather driveway, so named because there's so many rocks in this path that no matter how heavily it rains, you're never ever going to get bogged on this track. Some places it's literally the exposed bare rock dome. Until we come to the end of the runway of what was once my ultralight aerial photography short takeoff and landing fantasy. Back in the days of my unquenched Beagles fetishes, where we arrive at Canada John's last pyramid. Voila, a flat top ziggurat outlined by the broken wing spar and bracing wires of his Mark III 35 horsepower Skycraft Scout, complete with the Australian Ultralight Federation registration sticker on one piece of the fuselage boom, and an A-frame strut member which Johnny himself manufactured and fitted under instruction. A matter of 23 years ago, when everything looked differently. If you look really closely, you can see that the A-frame strut immediately in front of his windscreen has what's called a fish and a splint and duct tape holding it in place where he's bent it. And this is one of the 2 struts which we helped him to make and fit onto his Mark III 35 horsepower Rotax Skycraft Scout with wing warping. And 23 years ago to the minute, John William Robson had finished doing his pre-flight and he'd started his engine, and at about now he would have been taken off. 23 years ago, taxiing out, you would have looked like that. Back in the days when you could buy avgas at the Glen Innes Airport. In the days of the way back when. And as he broke ground, test flying a new fine pitch propeller, so he was 5% slower at any particular engine RPM than whatever he was used to, because his old prop didn't climb well enough, and he just fitted the new one. However, he was in moderate to severe turbulence, and he was having fun. These pictures were taken several weeks earlier when he was practicing ground runs up and down the runway. And 23 years ago, the arrangement was we were going to meet in town and go out and reshoot these photographs. However, old mate's plans had changed, you see. From sundown the previous afternoon, when he was going to go south to Armadale, visit friends, he in fact went northwest to Rumry's Hill and visited and stayed with friends. So he didn't come through Glen Innes, and we didn't meet up, and we thought he'd recognise that the turbulence was too strong and the winds were too vicious to go out and capture some aerial photographs. So old mate went out there on his own to do some test flying in moderate to severe turbulence. And you can see him looking at the back of the engine. Well, sadly, what none of us realised at the time was there was supposed to be a cage over the cooling fan on the back of the engine, which was belt driven at twice the speed of the crankshaft. But we didn't know that because the engine arrived in bubble wrap, and the first engine that came with the aeroplane shook its carburettor off, so we helped him fit the new engine and made the new strut, because the 22 horsepower Robin Scout only had that strut, and for the weight of the engine, he required the 35 horse engine, he required an extra strut. So anyway, old mate liked to fly down the glide slope in about the attitude the aeroplane's sitting in. He liked to be able to look under the engine and see the runway in front of him. He was never much of a fan of the idea of shutting the engine right off and sticking the nose down and gliding at, say, twice your stall speed until you reach the threshold and then flaring for a landing. What he liked to do was lift the engine up to get it out of his way and motor down the glide slope at about 30 or 40% power, as if he was a jumbo jet trying to land at an international airport. And 23 years ago, to the minute, while he was in his final turn at about 300 feet, there was a sheep having pregnancy convulsions in the paddock underneath. And I reckon he looked at it and he side slipped. Or maybe turbulence just threw him up into a bit of a steep bank and he started to side slip. And the span-wise airflow from the side slip caused his throttle cable to touch against the back of his engine, and it was picked up by the cooling fan and it winched in. And that A, stopped the crankshaft, and B, pulled the throttle cable out of the carburettor. And it happened right in front of his face. And $1,000 gets you a peanut that instead of kicking the nose straight with the rudder and stuffing the nose down, when the top wing stalled because he was dragging himself down the glide slope with 30% power, what happened is he tried to use the wing warping in lieu of the ailerons that the aeroplane didn't have, and that stalled his right wing even deeper. Which of course proved to be irrecoverable. And as I once put it in poetry, Canada John, the story to tell, he flew very hard but not very well. He soared through the air and his mind was at ease, but he liked it the best, twice the height of the trees. And he never did care just how much was his speed, for that was boring to know, was what he believed. He liked to land in a paddock and wash his feet by the river, or overfly a friend's house, slowly, making them shiver. Until John in his plane, which was painted bright red, was turning finals to land when his motor stopped dead. Well, he stalled and he spun in a vertical dive, and Johnny's last deed while he were alive. 'Twas so typical of himself that we should try not to weep. The old kamikaze greenie put his wing through a sheep. And he had about 3 seconds between seeing the sheep and being part of its landscape. And he actually cut the sheep in half with the outboard end of this wing spar. 23 years ago, when he impacted in the paddock on the other side of the road, just about there. And because he came to me for advice about aeroplanes, and because I knew what his last name was, my task was to go and have a look at the wreckage and identify him in a body bag for the police and write a report for the coroner and write a letter to his parents back in Canada. On the one hand, I sort of feel like it's pretty much my fault for not keeping him alive for longer than I did. But to have extended his life by way of stopping him from dying in his aeroplane would have required going in with a set of cable cutters and chopping his flying wires in half to stop him from taking off. Another way of looking at it is that there was 5 years before he first decided that he wanted to fly aeroplanes and came to me, and I gave him a box of books and explained to him that aeroplanes were not really a good idea for him. And then 3 years down the track after that, he came back, and this time to get here, he didn't know the way to my hut. And the previous time I'd been living in the village of Red Range. So he sought instructions and he lost his way 7 times in trying to get here. And eventually, after speaking to my next door neighbour and not seeing the upside down tree with the stone arrow hanging in it, he walked in through the tree line from over there after bogging his car in the rocks in my next door neighbour's paddock. And he told me that he'd done everything else that he ever wanted to do in his life and he was bored. And the only thing that he hadn't achieved, which had long been an ambition, was to go flying. So some friends of his in Armidale had convinced him to just go flying. Don't take any notice of what Muggins says about him not being the sort of person who should play with aeroplanes, just go flying. Okay, so he wanted to do that. And on his last night on his property, before he conducted his kamikaze attack on the sheep a couple of days later, because he had another house, he had a pyramid. He had a pyramid on a building site on Waitalabar, which was like his holiday house, because he had 100 acres 30 k's further down the road towards the coast. On his last night in his house on Arunachala, I remonstrated with him for flying low and slow, because in this aviation game, height is safety. The higher up you are, the longer you got to figure out where to put it if the engine stops. And he said that he knew all that. But you know, Chris Obermai, if I were to die in my airplane, I wouldn't mind so much because I'm having so much fun. You know, I like the soundless explosion of colour when the birds fly out of the trees, when they run away from the sound of my engine when I'm flying just through the treetops. He just sort of had the right attitude for playing the guitar and not the right attitude for playing with aeroplanes. But he didn't care, because his father had been in the Canadian Air Force and he grew up wanting to fly. And although I convinced him that it was a bad idea to drink beer before flying your aeroplane, I never quite did get it through his head that if you want to fly aeroplanes and you want to smoke pot, then you have to wait till the very end of the day when you finish flying before lighting up. So that's what happened to Canada, John. Against all advice, he went test flying in moderate to severe turbulence, too low, too slow. I'm pretty sure he was stoned at the time. And as it says in the famous sonata, line, poetry, epithet, obituary, Aviation, while not inherently dangerous, is to an even greater degree than the sea terribly unforgiving of mistakes. Funeral services were held in 7 places: at the crash site, on Waitalabar, at Armidale, at Lismore, in Sydney, in Kobe in Japan, and in Vancouver in Canada. And on Waitalabar, the wake went on for a week.